talked with a couple of times earlier. He's assistant professor in the Department of Speech, Language, Hearing, with the courtesy appointment in electrical engineering and computer science, and affiliations with the Neuroscience graduate program and the Bioengineering graduate program. He earned his PhD from Boston University in the area of computational neuroscience of speech, motor control, and in 2009, and continued at Boston University as a research assistant professor before coming to KU in 2012. His research interests are in the neurological mechanism underlying speech and communication and their use in brain-machine interfaces. And as I told him, I'm especially interested in what he has to say personally.
All right, well, thank you very much, Earl, for inviting me to this, and everyone else for showing up and hearing what I have to say. You'll notice that the title is a little bit different than what I had initially said. This is a little bit more specific about the types of work that we do in the lab. I figure I would just take a second and describe how I got here. So I do have an undergraduate degree in computer science, I have another undergraduate degree in philosophy, a graduate degree in computational neuroscience, and somehow I ended up in a clinical department for speech-language pathology and audiology. And the reason why this all makes sense is that the computer science and philosophy aspect actually got me interested in topics in artificial intelligence and machine learning and trying to understand the capabilities of computers for perceiving the world around us. After my undergraduate career, I moved on to Temple University, where I was a research assistant in a visual psychophysics lab. So we were exploring visual illusions. Some of the most famous ones are the Knizia square and triangle, where you have sort of four Pac-Man looking things that are arranged, and what you perceive is a square, even though there's no square on the screen anywhere. And so as part of that work, my role was as an experimenter, but really what I was thinking about was, well, I can write code, so why can't I write code to simulate human performance on this and just get rid of the participants altogether? Turns out that's a really difficult problem, but it's a problem that was being addressed by faculty members at Boston University in the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems. And so I ended up going to BU ostensibly to work on visual perception and computational methods on computer vision and understanding how the brain perceives visual stimuli around us, and got hooked on speech motor control instead. And then I finished my graduate degree working on computational models of speech production, like Earl had mentioned, where we were actually trying to simulate brain activity or understand brain activity as it related to the motor action of speech. And so I want everyone to kind of think about speech in terms of its motor capabilities or its motor responsibilities, because speech and language are things that people take for granted, especially when you can speak well and you can understand language well. But it really is a complicated process that can be split between the ability to form messages from an abstract representation like language, and then to actually communicate those messages through the vocal musculature. And what I'm most interested in is that vocal musculature part of can we simulate the vocal musculature, or can we find some other way to produce communicative output for people who are no longer able to use their vocal musculature for one reason or another. Most often in my field, we consider people who have amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease. We also consider cases of brainstem stroke, where people who do have a stroke in the brainstem, it leaves them completely locked in, so no functional movement of the periphery, sometimes movement of the eyes, but not even then. And so the methods that we kind of develop are how can we translate our knowledge of the neural mechanisms underlying speech motor control for a rehabilitative outcome. And so that's how I got to KU, because our speech department is really in the top 10 in the country, and they have expertise in something called augmentative and alternative communication. This is a method for providing communication to individuals who have difficulty with spoken communication, either through cognitive or motor deficits, and the brain-computer interfaces that I'll talk about are really just an extension of that technique. Whereas augmentative alternative communication, especially the high-tech version of these types of things, involve computers. You can touch icons on the screen, you can spell with them. You know, all of our modern cell phones are essentially communication devices now, assistive communication devices now. But these other ones are specifically designed to facilitate language competency and literacy and access to spoken language. And brain-computer interfaces are really just doing the same thing, but eliminating the need for voluntary motor control. So traditional AAC devices require the hand to move, use a stylus, use a joystick, use a mouse, use a head pointer even. The more sophisticated ones use eye tracking technology, so we can place cameras on the computer screen and track the corneas as they're moving across the screen, and use eye gaze to select icons on the screen. But if you can't even do those actions, or you can't do those actions reliably, you're left without an option, and that's where the brain-computer interfaces come in. So, that is my background. That's how I got to a rehabilitative department from my computational background. And we'll just go through the rest of this. So I'm calling this now using imagined and preparatory motor activity to control assistive devices for speech communication and the neurophysiological correlates of speech. What does that all mean? Essentially everything that I just said. How can we use motor-based activity in the brain, both the active production of motor activity or movements, and in particular imagined movements, and those brain processes that are involved in planning those movements. These are two very distinct processes. One happens before the other. And that's critical because in order to be useful, a brain-computer interface or any sort of communication prosthesis needs to be able to predict upcoming communication rather than simply confirm previously understood communication. Both have places, absolutely, but if we can tie into both aspects of that process, I think we can develop a more robust and accurate device. So what is a brain-computer interface? I tend to show this example first because this is something that most people at least have heard of. What's shown here on the left side of the screen is a cochlear implant. So by this point, many people know somebody with a cochlear implant. They were initially used in adults who had acquired hearing loss and were good candidates for a cochlear implant. They had already acquired language and could therefore re-access their linguistic capabilities through the introduction of electrical hearing. So rather than your eardrum vibrating and causing translation of mechanical energy into the cochlea, an electrode stimulates directly the auditory nerve inside of the cochlea in a way that mimics the way the signal processing of the actual ear operates. So this type of device is solving an input problem. It's solving a sensory problem of how can a artificial device perceive the world, listen to sound, decompose sound, and then use what we understand about the peripheral neurophysiology of the ear and the hearing mechanism to then replicate what a damaged or defective biological device is no longer able to do. And so that's exactly what's being shown here. An electrode goes in, it wraps around the cochlea and stimulates the auditory nerve where it enters. Another version of this, an input version, is the retinal implant. There are a couple clinical trials going on around the country. Once again, this is an input problem. So taking the visual scene, decomposing luminance, and then directly stimulating the optic nerve through the retina itself. This has particular application for individuals who perhaps have damaged retinas but intact optic nerves. So like I said, this is an input problem. What we're trying to do is solve the output problem. And the output problem is a little bit different because our source is far more unknown than the input problem. The input problem, we know exactly what the signal is that we're dealing with that's coming in. It's sound, it's light, or it's something like that. We have years, decades of psychophysical experience describing how those signals interact with the brain. And then the actual translation of those signals into commands that your brain can understand is also really well understood because we're dealing with the brain at its most peripheral point, which, though not simple, is its simplest point. The cochlea decomposes sound into frequencies and stimulates nerves appropriately. The retina does the same thing. The retina is spatially organized so that light coming in above stimulates a retinal cell from above and follows a path that we can trace through the optic nerve into the thalamus, through into the visual cortices of the brain, and then outwards. So we can actually follow that path fairly regularly and very robustly, but that input portion is really well understood. The motor problem, the output problem, what we're trying to do is uncover user intent, right? So uncover what you're about to do before you do it, or as you're doing it, and use that to control a device that can affect your, be a new end effector. So it can be a new limb, a new prosthetic limb that's going on right now, or in the case of what we do, a communication device. So identifying your intentions for operating a communication device and then allowing that device to create messages and then communicate for you. So here are a couple of examples. It's not immediately clear from any of these what exactly they do, so I'll describe them just a little bit. This one on the top left is something, well, this is a refined version of it, but it's called hexospell. It was initially hexagrams. And what happens here is that you can see a little dot in the middle of the screen, and out from this dot grows an arrow. And the arrow can rotate clockwise around each of these items. And so what happens here is that imagine movements of the right hand rotate the arrow, and imagine movements of the left hand grow the arrow until it intersects with one of these circles around, or hexagrams. Each of these circles or hexagrams has a set of letters in them, so in this way you can do rotations and selections to choose letters for spelling words and messages. So in this case, it's a left and right hand motor imagery. Or if you are locked in, these are right and left hand motor attempts. We're actually asking people to try to move their arms, and we're detecting the neurological potentials related to those attempted movements. The same sort of thing is happening in this bottom left one, so I won't go into it too much. If you do squint very carefully, you can see an instruction for left hand movements versus right hand movements, hands together, and then the feet moving. So we can do very good things with decoding your intention or your attempted movements of the peripheral limbs. The two on the right are visual devices, so I kind of have stayed away from the input problem again, and this isn't an input problem. This is using the central nervous system's response to visual stimuli in order to make a relationship between stimulus on the screen and a message to be produced. And so in this case, this top right, this is something called the P300 speller. And what happens here is that rows and columns randomly flash. This is going to start eliciting neural activity in something called the oddball paradigm. This is something that's very well studied in visual psychophysics and visual electrophysiology. And essentially what happens is that there's a change in brain activity 300 milliseconds after the presentation of a stimulus that is unexpected or is rare in some way compared to other distractors. And so if you're looking for the letter D here, when this first row gets highlighted, that is a rare event because every other row will be highlighted in random order and every other column will be highlighted in random order, making this have 12 sets of possible highlights, 10 of which are distractors and 2 of which are targets. So that makes them rare, that will generate this potential. We can detect when that potential occurs and then associate that with the flashing of the row and column that led to, that included the D in it, and in that way create a message. I have an example of this here. This is not my lab, but this is something that you can find on YouTube, and that's what I did and downloaded it. So what's going to happen here is that this person is wearing an EEG cap. This is a commercial cap that we can discuss later if you're interested. It's got some issues. But what it can do very well is record visual activities of the brain, and you're going to see different letters and numbers be highlighted here, and eventually have letters be selected across the top. He's going to be trying to spell the word epic, E-P-O-C, because this is the emotive epic headset. And so he'll be paying attention to the E first, the P is somewhere down here, the O is next to it, and then the C again. But I'd like you to appreciate, and things have gotten better than they used to be, this takes a really long time. And so we're just going to take a couple-minute break while this happens. I'll get us going a little bit. So we have the E was selected, so that meant he was paying attention to it, and there was one of these potentials fired for every repetition. So this has to happen a number of times, anywhere between 2 to 11 repetitions of each flash, just to have enough signal to noise ratio, so enough detectability of the target stimulus over all those background signals to determine whether or not it was being attended to.
So the signal is coming from his brain, not from it doesn't involve his eyes at all.
Not at all.
So he's thinking P.
He's thinking P, but by thinking P, he's actually focusing his attention on the letter P that's being flashed.
Visually.
And so this can be with overt visual attention, so the actual movement of the eyes toward that letter. Lots of studies have found out that this is the optimal situation. You obtain the best results this way. But there's a decrease in accuracy, but you're able to do this with covert imagery. So this is particularly useful if you're not able to move the eyes. You can still covertly attend. If I ask anybody here to focus on the wheat on the table, you can still see things around you, especially if they start flashing. And you can use that information for doing this type of decoding as well. There's an alternate version. I'm going to stop this. This gets old. There is an alternate version of this that only displays information to the center of the screen. And so this is something called rapid serial visual presentation. This would entail the presentation of each letter in random order, one at a time, in serial order in the middle of the screen. So this is even better for people who are not able to move their eyes, because they can maintain focus on the center of the screen. That means they can use overt visual attention and generate some of these better responses. So what's happening here is that this is importantly a sensory-based electrophysiological technique. So you have to have viewed the image on the screen. You have to be able to see and comprehend the task instruction of paying attention to one thing and not another. And the potential is only elicited when the visual stimulus is present. So this is different than detecting user intentions, like what I'm going to be talking about with motor imagery. So this is the state of the art, actually. This is the thing that's most popular in BCI right now. So what I've just shown you is this path in my little flow chart of brain-computer interfaces. I call it cognitive decision processing or attention-modulated perception. This is your ability to make decisions on sensory information that has been provided to you. So just like those flashing and paying attention to the E when it's flashed and so on. What happens is that neurological activity itself isn't actually related to a letter or a phoneme or some form of communication output. It's related to the flashing light, right? The fact that it's in the shape of a letter is convenient for our purposes and facilitates our goal of communication. But this potential will be generated and has been shown to be generated in greater amplitude if faces are flashing on the screen instead of light, or shapes are flashing instead of light. So really what has to happen here is that this electrophysiological response to light stimulation has to be translated into a text symbol, and we do that through the interface, and then it goes out for output as written language. What the goal of my work, and hopefully the goal of most of our work, is to go directly from imagined speech productions or attempted speech productions by people who are unable to speak directly into acoustic output, so replacing the vocal tract. I'm going to discuss what we do in the lab here at KU that is on two ends of that spectrum. One is going to be a motor-based brain-computer interface that is designed to interact directly with existing augmentative alternative communication devices, the things that I mentioned at the very beginning. And then another one that is getting us closer to direct auditory output without any sort of translation stage, based on your ability to imagine making some movements and it directly results in auditory output. So these are descriptions of the two systems, and this is an example of what an AAC device looks like. Here are a couple more. There are lots of manufacturers. They're not this bulky anymore. They're getting smaller and smaller, but all of them have something that is very common. They have a grid layout where you have items on that grid that can be selected, and they can do things like indicate wants and needs of an individual. They can say, I'm hungry, I'm cold, I'm tired. I can do things like forming full messages using a keyboard or using smaller phrases to build full sentences. And what we'd like to do is to use their existing capability, but provide input to it through a brain-computer interface. And we're calling this a virtual switch. And so all of these devices have an ability to have switches placed on them for activation. So what happens is that you could imagine this grid location is highlighted by a red square. If you have no movement or very little movement, and you can move maybe your finger just a little bit or your tongue just a little bit, if I have this red square, not shown, but let's imagine it is, move across the screen, I can ask you to make your finger movement or make your tongue movement, and that can act like a mouse click, which would then select whatever is underneath